So let me just start by saying welcome to all of you. Thank you for joining us. We are so pleased today to put on this event in partnership with our colleagues at Mahindra. And thank you, Ritika and Ninad, for your partnership. Um, and we're extremely pleased and honored to have with us as our speaker and guest, Dr. Surjit Bhalla, who serves as the Executive Director for South Asia at the IMF. We were actually planning this as an in-person roundtable in March when the pandemic lockdown here in the U.S. and frankly in India as well forced us all to postpone our plans as we scrambled to manage the implications of the economic shutdown and that was having on our businesses and also on all of the multiple myriad challenges that posed. But here we are today, 6 months later, and starting to think about what a post-COVID world looks like, and starting to think about what the recovery path looks like. We know that the impact of COVID has been quite severe on the United States, on India, and around the world. And we've seen some of the economic data that has come out in recent days about what that economic toll has been. So I think this is a particularly important and timely moment for us to take a step back and to think about not only what we have come through, but what the future looks like and how we should contextualize that future. And there's no one better to help us do that than, Dr. Bhalla. So with that very brief preamble, I want to I will make one or two other points on the economic opportunity and focus, which is that as we hear from Dr. Bhalla today, I want all of our colleagues at USIBC to also be mindful that we are formulating our budget recommendations for the Indian government that we will flow in. You should all be hearing from your counterparts at USIBC asking for your priorities, your suggestions, your comments. So please take that point and flow in some of the thoughtful conversation today into your own thinking about what you would want to see us highlight in our budget recommendation. It's one that we take a lot of time and effort with, and so this is particularly timely in that sense as well. Nalima Pargankar, who manages and oversees our financial services here from the U.S. side, will further guide on that at later in the program as well. But with that said, let me turn to a good friend and colleague over at Mahindra, Ritika Batra, and have her engage on an overview and scene setting as well as an introduction of Dr. Bhalla as we launch into this program. Ritika, thank you so much, and over to you.
Thank you so much, Nisha. As you said, this is timely, and I'm really, really glad to be able to do this with Dr. Bhalla. Dr. Bhalla, welcome back to the U.S. As I will go through your bio, U.S. is not new to you. You've studied here, you worked here in California and East Coast. So welcome back to the U.S. in the new avatar. We will be talking about the Indian economy pre-COVID, post-COVID. It's standing in the world right now, specifically in the Indo-Pacific. But before that, for the audiences, I would like to talk a little bit about your background, if I may. So Dr. Bhalla currently is the executive director at the IMF for India, Bhutan, Bangladesh, and Sri Lanka, starting November 2019. So we'll be completing his first year here in November this year. He's had his doctorate and master's from Princeton. But as I said, he's not new to the U.S. He has worked here in the U.S. before coming this time in the banking world with Deutsche Bank and Goldman Sachs. Before that, he also started sort of working in California, probably his first job in Fairchild Semiconductors. And after that, he's also had association with Rand Corporation and Brookings Institute. Interestingly, before he joined the government in various capacities, for a very long time, he's also run his own consultancy called Oxis Research and Investment from 96 to 2016, so almost a decade. Recently, before coming to Washington, D.C. at the World Bank, he was the chairman of the advisory group on trade and Ministry of Commerce with the Government of India. Before that, he was also the advisory member of the Finance Commission in India with the Government of India. So again, welcome to the conversation, Dr. Bhalla. I would like to sort of ask you a few questions so that we can get into the details of the conversation for the audience that are listening in. Let's begin by talking about the recent reforms that the Government of India had brought in or introduced before COVID, whether we talk about the GST, the land reform, the current agricultural reform policy that the Government of India has brought in. Would you think that just when we had started seeing the impact of these reforms in the Indian economy surfacing, we were hit by the pandemic? Do you think things would have been slightly different had the pandemic not hit us? And staying on the pandemic, do you think the lockdown had any impact, good, bad, in comparison to all the other countries that have had a lockdown? Also, we talk about India's relevance in the Indo-Pacific in the current state. Do you think that it is India's ambition to have a stronger say and presence in the Indo-Pacific economy, or you think this is an influenced outlook for India? And lastly, we've had many conversations with colleagues at IMF, and IMF has been very vocal supporting India's first stimulus package that was introduced at the very beginning of the pandemic, when we were hit by the pandemic, immediately after the lockdown. There is a lot of public discourse about, is this the right time for the next stimulus? If yes, why? If not, why? So I would say, with these kind of opening questions, I would hand it over to you to talk to us for a few minutes, and then we'll sort of have a deep dive into other questions. So over to you, Dr. Bhalla.
Yeah. Thank you very much for inviting me for this talk. I'm looking forward to it. I hope I am able to answer the various questions that you have. And they're all very good questions and very appropriate and very relevant for what is going on right now. I'll organize my few 10, 15 minutes talk around three questions, and you'll see that the link with your questions. First, on lockdowns, what has happened. The second, related to lockdowns, is the GDP numbers that came out for the first fiscal quarter. I'll keep referring to it as April, June, which makes it easier for everybody else. Then I want to go into, even prior to the lockdown, we had reforms. We were beginning to have reforms. The tax cut, corporate tax cut, came in October of 2019. And a few months later, this was hit. But even at that time, there was a recognition by the government that the growth had slowed down from something like 8% to something like 5%. And I want to comment on why I think the growth slowed down then, and why now we'll get, if you will, payback, and why growth should accelerate post the pandemic. And last but not least is, what can we expect the future to look like, the future post-pandemic future to look like, both in India in an absolute sense and in the world. So let me first go with the lockdown, which is obviously the biggest elephant in the room in the world. And countries have gone into lockdowns. We went into a lockdown. And the question that I think all of us need to ask and have asked is we know that the lockdowns had a negative effect on output, on activity, on incomes, on work. By definition, a lockdown would lead to a decline in economic activity. The relevant question is, did we achieve, by we I mean the world, achieve anything in the health direction? In other words, did we save lives by going through lockdown? Did we decrease infections by going through a lockdown? And I'm afraid, and you can pick up any paper, any newspaper, anywhere in the world, and all of them doubt that the lockdowns had a significant health benefit. And I'm afraid that a closer perusal of the data suggests that there were no significant, matter of fact, I conclude in my paper, there weren't any, and this is for analysis for the whole world, not just India, not just the US. So I think going forward, one important question is why and how did the lockdowns come about? They came about because of expert advice by the pandemic specialists, by the virologists, by the infection experts, etc. And countries around the world, politicians around the world had little choice but to go by this expert advice, which they did. And I'll just conclude this little section on lockdowns that in terms of excess deaths, the 1957-58 pandemic, flu pandemic, people compare this to the 1918 Spanish flu, but really it's more comparable to the late 50s, and especially in the US. And what you have is excess deaths then in the US were the same as excess deaths today. And the US did not go through, neither did any expert advocate a lockdown. So I think this is something that we all need to look at because it's had such a devastating impact on people's lives that we need to worry about whether we did achieve anything. And by we, obviously, I mean the world. Now we come to, and that really the only people advising, economists were not involved in the advice to the lockdown. It was the health experts. So I'm afraid you may have to have a session with your favorite health experts or any health experts as to how they came up with this idea of a lockdown. Unprecedented, never in the world has a lockdown operated. And here we have every country in the world practically doing a lockdown. This is, I think, bizarre, beyond bizarre, but that's the reality. That reality has impacted the GDP, impacted economic growth, which is the subject I want to turn to. And we all know that India's performance in the April-June quarter was amongst the worst economic performance in the world, or amongst the G20 important countries. Now, we all agree that this pandemic was terrible, that it was necessary. I don't believe, but clearly the world believes it was necessary, and that a growth decline would be a small cost to pay. But when we look at the GDP numbers, whether for US or India, you either do a year-on-year comparison or you do a seasonally adjusted. And the point being, this minor technical detail, that seasonal adjustments do not work when you have such an outlier. So for example, India's growth rate was minus 25%. Now, no expert is claiming that for the year it will be minus 25%. The second, on the growth rate around the world, what we have is that the Atlanta Fed has just come out with this now forecasting model for the US, and it shows about an 8% GDP growth rate in the US. In India, the PMI for manufacturing is now in positive territory, and in services this month, that is September, is likely to head into positive territory. So the point about GDP growth is it's a big shock, something that, real unfortunate. We can go into the reasons, but that is now tending to be a little bit in the background, and we have to now look for the future and what is likely to happen. On that, just a side note, one of the positive effects of the lockdown on India in particular is that the critics now believe GDP data in India. So when the GDP was growing at 6, 7, 8%, you can line them all up, and they were all there saying, no, this is not believable. GDP growth in India is actually much lower. And strangely, all these critics are now fully accepting even a lockdown-induced big decline in GDP. So, this is one of the positive aspects about India. We are a free country. Critics are allowed to come up with whatever views they would like to. But I want to point out that where were they and why were they criticizing the GDP data, which I think was very, very unfortunate and very unfair to the people who collect the CSO, which collects the data. Okay, now I want to come to, look, as I mentioned in my opening remarks, that we have the GDP growth in India had slowed down prior to the lockdown from something like 8% to something like 5%. And as I just mentioned, the critics thought we were growing at 3%. So now I will not speak about the critics anymore because their credibility is rather low. But we were growing at 5%, and much below what most of us wanted, what the politicians wanted, what the economy wanted, what was our trend rate of growth. And I think there were two major reasons, which, and I'm happy to provide chapter and verse in terms of academic papers, etc., documenting this, that there were two major reasons. And I think the most important reason was that interest rates in India, real interest rates, were phenomenally high, the highest in the world. Never before in Indian history were real policy rates as high as between 2016 and 2018-19. These are real interest rates of something like 3%. Mind you, the median real interest rate in developing countries and developed economies in that same time period was something like minus 0.8. And we were at 2.5, 3, 3.5. Now, we have been in the camp in India that we don't think interest rates matter. Everywhere else, the debate on economy, including here in the US, obviously, is on what is the level of the real interest rate. And interest rate, monetary policy as per the policy rate. In India, that debate, unfortunately, especially amongst the critics, etc., is not relevant. That's the good news coming out of COVID, that I think interest rates in India today are very realistic. If you will, real interest rates are somewhat negative. And, with recovery, they will move into positive territory. But I think Indian policymakers are now aware of the costs of high real interest rates, and we followed that path. Unfortunately, we followed 2016 to 2018 was a peak of that unfortunate path. But one of the lessons of the pandemic is that we are unlikely, I will make a forecast, we are unlikely to go back to those real paths. So that's a real plus for Indian GDP growth going forward. As you know, in the West, lower for longer, that's where the Fed is committed to, the ECB is committed to, the Bank of Japan is committed to. And I think by definition almost, we'll be low for longer in India and other emerging markets as well. Another very important part of competitiveness is to have policy rates competitive. Something didn't happen in India before. Second, as I mentioned earlier, we had a tax cut in 2019, September, and there may be possibilities of more tax cut. Basically, we are at about 22%, and our competitors are somewhere between 15 and 20. But we had a big decline in the tax rate, corporate tax rate, in September, October 2019. That is going to stay forward. That is to say, those tax cuts are going to stay. I don't see anybody arguing for an increase in the corporate tax rates. And I think there's a distinct possibility, at least I would like to think, that there is a possibility that over time, these tax rates become more competitive. So those are two big policy directions, policy pluses that are in the offing. Now I want to get into forecasting the future, which is not what we are paid to do, but what we have to do. Part of the professional promise or the expectation is there. So, and in forecasting the future, the delta is the most important. By delta, I mean the change. We can't, think about assessing what the future will look at by going by the old models which have worked for 20, 30 years or whatever, old levels of interest rates, old levels of tax rates, etc. There is a third element which is perhaps not given as much attention to regarding the potential growth rate of India. For the two additional elements. One, we are much more open to foreign investment than we've ever been before. That does not mean that we have reached nirvana, there'll be no more opening up, but we are much more conscious of the need for foreign capital, foreign investment, foreign technology. And as you know, one of the new reforms is on defense, as well as infrastructure, allowing foreign companies to come in. And I hear that Apple is now producing large amounts in India. This was not there before. And indeed, anytime there was discussion about foreign investment, especially from the U.S., there was all kind of objections as to why that should not be the case. This is a fundamental change in the mindset of the policymakers in India, that we are much more open to foreign investment than we ever were before. Then there is, we talk about, and these are the last 2 points I would make, and I think I would have stayed within my time limit, that whether you want to look at inclusive growth or gender equality, India has shown one of the largest increases on both. For example, it might be news to some, that the Oxford University in 2018, for the first time, had more female undergraduates than male graduates. For the first time in this 1,000-year history. Well, India, all aggregate universities in India, college enrollment of women in India is higher than that of men. So this is and this has been going on for maybe 5-7 years. There's a radical change in thinking about women in India, about their role and their productivity. This is going to, we've had, the debates about the female labor force participation rate is very low, etc. And maybe on another occasion you can invite me and I'll discuss in detail. But let us not ignore this fundamental change towards gender equality and gender productivity that is now there in the Indian economy. And I think will be a huge asset going forward. Last but not least, if you want to look at inclusive growth, between 2011 and 2017, that the non-salaried workers had about a 4% annual increase in real wages, and the salaried workers had about only a 1% increase. So there are these trends which are, on education, on gender equality, on inclusive growth, on reforms, on continuing reforms, political stability. If as an economist and as a forecaster, and not as an Indian, I would say that I can't think of historically when there was a better time to invest in India, or when India had greater potential for faster growth than now. So this is, we can look to a much, much brighter future in India on all counts, including not the least political stability. So this is truly going to be India's decade, both in an absolute sense and in a relative sense. I can't hear you.
Nalima, you're muted.
Yeah.
There, can you hear me now, Dr. Bhalla?
Yes, absolutely. Yeah.
Thank you so very much. It was incredibly insightful and refreshing to hear your comments, because so much of the discussion has focused on the negative aspects of the economic downturn. And I think what's important to remember is that even as the economic downturn has sort of played itself out, companies haven't been still. Companies have been very proactive to remain resilient. And, they've reorganized supply chains, they've started working remotely, they're making very difficult financial decisions. And your comments are bringing to light a very encouraging and positive picture as these very companies look to their investment plans and operations in India, not just in the COVID itself, but in the aftermath of the COVID environment, and truly how to continue moving forward, even when there remains some significant uncertainty about the length and duration and continued depth of the pandemic. We're going to get to questions, I know, but there are a few interesting points that you've mentioned that I would like to highlight. The demographic construct that you've highlighted, the gender, the high levels of education, the inclusion of gender in the workforce, those are in many ways very fixed in the sense that they existed before the pandemic, they exist through, and they will continue to exist. And I think many of the companies who are our members recognize those assets. There's some folks on the phone who are very much aligned
with the objective of continuing to include that. So I think it's really important for us to remember that the fundamental characteristics you've identified for us continue to remain there, even though the pandemic may be distracting. And I don't mean that in a superficial way, but even though the pandemic may have taken our attention and resources away. The second thing I'd like to reflect on your comments is the delta in the mindset with respect to an invitation for greater FDI. As you can imagine, that's of real importance to the companies who are around the table today to hear your thoughts. FDI is something that all of our folks have not only done, but continue to look to do in ways that will not only bring naturally growth to their own operations, but some of the benefits of their global operations to the Indian economy. And it's important to understand from you sort of that mindset change in FDI, particularly as the umbrella position of inviting FDI is there. There is work underneath that needs to be done to make that possible in a very real way. And so I'm glad to hear that even as USIBC and other companies, we make that effort to have the conversations about increasing FDI, that the base commitment is there, so that when we get to the difficult piece of how to actually operationalize that FDI and bring it in, that there is a willingness and hopefully interest to work together. Areas such as insurance and other key sectors are very committed to deepening that. So I thank you for highlighting that as a significant change. I know that I've received some questions in the email for those folks who weren't able to. I'd like to, before we get to Ritika Bhatra's first question, I'd like to share with everyone how they can ask questions. You can, if you are on video, you can open up your video and your microphone and ask a question. In addition, you can, in the chat function that's at the top of your screen and the panel that you have, you can type in a question as well. And then if you are on the phone, you can press *6, unmute yourself, and ask a question. So we look forward to hearing all of your thoughts. And as you prepare them, I'd like to ask Ritika to ask the first question and get us started. Ritika?
Thank you so much, Nilima, and thank you so much, Dr. Bhalla. I think amongst all the things that we discussed, we still need to address the proverbial elephant in the room, or in this case, the dragon in the room, which is China. Do you think that the world looks at India as just an alternative to China? Or do you think there is some more strategic reason to look towards India to fill that gap? And as somebody wise recently said, that India has always been the midterm and the long-term option for investment for the whole world. But what do you think India needs to do in the short term to grab this opportunity, the gap that has been left, so to say, by China in this whole, whether we talk about supply chain or infrastructure, manufacturing, all of those things? What do you think India should be doing in the short term to grab that opportunity to its fullest potential? Thank you.
Yeah. Let me, and it's linked to what Nilima also asked in terms of the mindset. I headed what is called a high-level advisory group for the Department of Commerce in India, whose report was released in September of last year, and which was a 12-member group of experts. And the key message in there was that our mindset, needs to change. Now, we recognize that the mindset has changed, but we emphasize, and it was well accepted by the government, this was a report done for the government, that the mindset was still, whether in terms of interest rates, which I talked about, whether in terms of tax rates, or whether in attitudes towards foreign investment, that we needed to change. And the government fully accepted that report, which I'm very pleased, accepted in the sense at least it was published, it was issued. So, and you know, in 2010, China moved over to value-added, higher value-added manufacturing, and we thought that India would take up the slack, and it didn't happen. It happened in Vietnam, it happened even in Bangladesh, but didn't happen in India. This time, it is different. And so therefore, there is a, I wrote a book called Devaluing to Prosperity, 2012, which documented that one of the reasons why China was able to grow so fast was because it deeply undervalued its exchange rate. The world has now come to recognize that there had been flaws in the international system, which allowed one country to be mercantilist. That was very plain and simple. So now this discussion about China's economic model and how the West, the free countries react to it, is now in the open. And I think, I don't know how it will go out, how it will pan out, but I do think that that is the U.S.-China divide is there to stay. And I'm encouraged by the fact that, Apple, some of the recommendations we made in our report, some independent of that, there is a distinct mindset change in India towards foreign investment and encouraging foreign investment, which was not there just a decade ago in 2010, 2012, 2014, and is there today. So I think it is a, one other important point on growth rates and foreign investments, etc. One of the reasons that I'm very, very bullish on India is that, look, the big determinant of relative GDP growth rates, per capita growth rates in the world, is something called catch-up. The further you are away from the frontier, the more possibilities there is if you get technology, etc., and investment. And we don't lack investment. Our investment rates are quite high, close to 30%. But foreign investment brings with it technology. So I think China's growth rate is now, 5% before the pandemic, 5.5%, is on the trend down. Indonesia's growth rate is on the trend down because they have exploited, or the catch-up has happened to a much greater degree there than India. So if we were sitting in Mars and we wanted to look at purely on a probabilistic basis, which country is further removed from the frontier, which has the policies and the potential to get to the frontier, India is numero uno. I really believe that. So, and I think foreign investors recognize that. They recognize that in the mid-90s when they flocked to China. They recognized that in 2010 around when they went into Vietnam. And now I think they recognize that for the next 2, 3, 4 decades, India is going to have, the demographic advantage, the education advantage, and really the democratic advantage that, compared to most other countries in the developing world, we are the freest. So I think that matters as well. And if the government is conducive and encouraging change, which it is, I think there's no stopping it.
Wonderful.
Thank you so much.
Thank you very much. Again, if those who are on the video wish to ask a question, please, there's a little hand icon. Just click on that and you can let me know that you wish to ask a question. Dr. Bhalla, I've received a question by email, and that question deals with your thoughts on the true impact of the economic and fiscal stimulus packages that have been released, but the and it says and the not just the need for the second impact stimulus, but really what its focus should be. Yeah. And where it needs to either continue the work that remains undone by the first, and what new sectors should be addressed.
Okay, so first, the economic stimulus package that was announced early on, as you know, that the critics also said that it wasn't, it was less than 1% of GDP, and it turned out it was more than that. And so all I want to point out is that when we look at the stimulus packages, there are critics that will say it's never enough. The point being that there is the stimulus package was there. And there is, if I believe the papers, another stimulus package is coming. And there is a sea change in the world and at the institution where I am. And I want to speak for the IMF, but I think IMF has clearly taken the lead in terms of combating the pandemic. And one of the ways in which it has taken the lead is that the IMF staff, the IMF management believes that fiscal deficits are not the holy cow they were before. And that one of the ways of getting back to normal is by expanding fiscal deficits. So, as you know, in India, there is a constant discussion, debate on, we can't get the fiscal deficit too high, but you can't have a fiscal deficit, you can't have a stimulus without expanding the fiscal deficit. So I think intellectually, both from the experts and the world's leading experts on macro are here at the fund, and in India, there is a movement. So I think the new package will be more stimulative than the first one. We need it. And we don't have to face the prospect. I certainly strongly believe that if we expand the fiscal deficit, which I hope we do, then it'll lead to inflation. One of the things that has happened in the world and in India, and which is why our policy 2016 to 2018-19 was so wrong on monetary policy, is that inflation is not a problem in the world. The median inflation rate in developed economies somewhere around 1.5%, and the median inflation rate in developing economies, this is before COVID, is somewhere around 3%. So the gap, this is unheard of. So I think one of the things that all investors, economists, etc., analyzing growth have to look at is that inflation is not a problem and is not likely to be a problem. So therefore, one can expand fiscal deficits, and one should expand fiscal deficits and provide stimulus.
Wonderful. Thank you. We do have a question, Mr. Ashok Swaroop.
Yeah, hi. Surjit, I was just wondering that, in the reforms that were announced during COVID, and what India was waiting for a long time is agricultural reform. How would you rate them? Because I think, in my view, they are going to be pretty game changing in terms of, making India one agricultural market. And this is something that we had been waiting for a long time. And how much of an impact do you think that's going to have in the GDP growth and in demand and in building demand in the rural areas? This is one. And secondly, going by what you said, and I'm getting a sense that that is going to happen. But the criticism has been that while in the first stimulus, there was largely, helping companies, MSMEs, and large companies with finance and with liquidity. There wasn't enough done on the demand side. And while you may have kind of given liquidity, because we are sensing it as a bank, that while there are people to borrow, but the demand is not there. So what do you think the government should do for that?
Okay. Look, I think there was a fair amount on the demand side, but I would agree with you. And the amount that was there on the demand side had to do with income redistribution or supplement of incomes for the bottom half of the population. The former one on MSMEs, as you know, so that forever, when we had the tight, indeed, I think the slowdown was induced by our misguided policy on MSMEs by the monetary authorities, etc. That has changed, and therefore I think it was very important to provide support to the MSMEs and get them back on a sound footing. Now, it's, reforms are never complete. It wasn't complete. More is happening, but I'm glad you brought up the agricultural reforms, which I don't know, but I think it's one of the most fundamental reforms that have taken place. It is a complete game changer, and because it doesn't fit with the critics who sort of dominate the airspace or the mind space or the ink space, it hasn't received the support amongst intellectuals, amongst intellectual economists that it should have. This was also one of the recommendations of the HLAC committee, and this is a sea change. To think that we have controlled the farmers, they can't sell who they have to sell to, they have to go to a mandi, and as you know, and it's well recognized, the corruption was at its peak with the agricultural controls. So I think, because, and one of the points actually, but I think it would have happened anyway, but I think it is larger, that in the pandemic, the agricultural sector has done rather well. And I think we are just beginning to see the benefits, multitude of benefits that will come out from the agricultural sector.
Thank you. Thank you, Dr. Bhalla. I see we have a hand up from Nisha. Would you share your thoughts?
Sure. Thank you so much. A lot of really interesting fodder, and obviously you're talking to a community of people who are big boosters of India, who believe in the India opportunity and want to see that grow. One of the things we hear from our members, though, particularly as we look at kind of the diversification of supply chains and to what extent is India a focus for some of that movement, one of the things that we hear is that while India has a great deal of political stability, that on policy stability and on policy coherence, that India is still a complicated ecosystem to navigate, that you don't necessarily have consistency and coherence across a wide cross-section of policy apparatus, and you don't have stability year to year. And how do you make big long-term investments in, you know, in bringing supply chains to India, which may take, you know, years or even a decade before you fully mature that investment, if you don't have the stability in the ecosystem. And the second point that I hear increasingly is, you know, the investor protections or dispute resolution mechanisms that can help navigate when there are challenges, to try to resolve those in a time efficient manner. So what can you kind of shed light on and maybe guide us on with respect to these 2 points?
Okay. Look, first, a very good set of questions, and I empathize with the thought process that goes into suggesting or coming out with those questions. And India is it's a 1.3 billion people. We'll always be complex. We'll always lack complete consistency and coherence. Absolutely agree. And it is something that, you know, we are one of the very few, if not the only, developing country, emerging market, etc., that is complex, and, you know, I don't think anybody would have it any other way. But that doesn't, so one is it's an asset and it's a liability. But we have to appreciate that it is an asset. At least in my view, it is a real asset. There's no place in the world that has the complexity, the diversity of views, thinking, openness, etc. But that's why I keep emphasizing the delta. If one looks at, and you've looked at, you know, India prior to 1990, we were another world, another planet. Then we moved to another planet closer to home, closer to the Earth, 1990 to 2014. And now we've moved even closer to Earth since 2014. The agricultural reforms talked about. Now coal mining is open to foreign investment. Defense is open to foreign investment. But, you know, and one of the recommendations of several committee reports was that we have a one-window policy for foreign investors, like is there in most other emerging markets, and hasn't come about. I don't know if it will come about, but I think the debate is on. It is part of a formal Government of India report. I think it should happen, but, you know, for the reasons that you implied, this is, we can't be dictatorial in India. So the only thing we can really hope for, expect, and applaud is the delta. And the delta really is, I've been following the Indian economy now for the last 45 years, is the strongest it's ever been. It's not there. We are not, it's not as if there won't be, there shouldn't be more reforms or changes in policy, but we are really improving year by year, policy by policy, in trying to get to what is called the frontier of economic, not only thought, we've always been at the frontier of economic thought, which is why we have 7 different policies when only 1 are needed. But that's, you know, it's a, but I recognize, and I think a foreign investor, you know, faces much less, you know, ease of doing business, again, is where we've shown significant improvements. But, you know, we are still 50th or 60th in the world. So we've got a lot of space to improve. which will add to our productivity, which will add to our growth, which will add to our traction for foreign investors, as well as domestic investors. Remember that the foreign investor should get some special treatment. But think of the poor Indian investor. So we have lived with it. We'll continue to live with it, and we continue to look for and encourage reforms and the delta. And I think that's the most heartening thing. We are not there and won't be there in my lifetime. But it's something that I take heart from, that we have really come a long way. But it's a marathon, and you're not at the finish line.
Nalima, you're muted again.
Can you hear me now? Yeah. Thank you, Dr. Bhalla. I do want to call on Virat Bhatia, Managing Director of Apple, to share some thoughts. And given that you've mentioned Apple a couple of times, I think it will be interesting to hear from him. Virat?
Thank you. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Great. So guilty as charged. Happy to be here, and good evening, Surjit. Good morning. I'm not sure which part of the world you are right now, but you look well, and it's so good to see you. We haven't spoken in a while. It is first and foremost, I must acknowledge that the report that Surjit spoke about, he wears his achievement so lightly that he doesn't want to mention much about that. That is a really first-rate report, and I had the great privilege of appearing before the committee and presenting. And I must say that one gets used to seeing these reports, and then once in a while a report comes along that sort of makes not only fantastic recommendations, but the government sort of owns it and takes it and runs with it. So that's been a great achievement, and one step at a time. And I completely endorse the point that Dr. Bhalla made about the fact that this is a slow but sure move. The part of that report that sort of drove excitement was that you targeted, and the committee targeted $1,000 billion of exports by 2025. We're at 310 merchandise and about 220 to 30 services, so about half that, which means both will have to double, or at least merchandise will have to more than double, given the services growth is probably limited at some stage. And we can, and so great news there. So there's fantastic hope, and I think the Prime Minister believes in this, and therefore the bureaucracy, everybody's lining up. My question to you was that India, as you know, it sort of lives in 3 centuries, but also thinks in about 5 different spaces. There is a whole deep-rooted sort of thought process of import substitution. Self-sufficiency is sort of often been interpreted as import substitution. For years and years that's been done. And that's not an easy mindset change to sort of push our. Sometimes when we talk about those numbers, our colleagues and bureaucrats don't even believe it. So we have to push them, saying, no, it can be done. And as you know, with import substitution comes the whole issue of protection and taxes and sort of all of those duties and all that, which Department of Revenue loves, obviously. What is there not to love about more money? And then there is export, where you need incentives and competitiveness, all of which go exactly against everything that you need to do for import substitution. So these are not step 1 and 2. In fact, they're opposites in terms of policy intervention. And it's a huge step. It's a massive step to be taken. And without $1,000 billion, as you mentioned, we will not hit 5 trillion. There's no question about that. We need to build, have 18-20% of our GDP as exports. China still has 16% of its GDP as exports, with 2.48 trillion out of 13 as exports. So, and now there is this whole challenge of pandemic for a year. The revenue is short. The government is extremely short on revenue. You know that better than anybody else. And IMF has been working on that. The World Bank has been clearing loans. How do you think and it seems the next 6 months will be difficult, but how do you think we make that change wherein the government starts to understand the need for competitiveness and move away from just import substitution to export, because export solves the import substitution problem anyway, because you become competitive. Nobody can import you. Where do you think, what is it that we can do as industry, as associations, to drive that and stop addressing the domestic market and start addressing, the 2 billion global citizens who roughly have the same income as 100 million Indian middle class that we keep speaking about? What else should we do? How do we go past this thought process? It's a mindset thing that I ask you. Sorry for the long-winded thing, but I thought I'll, place it, because we're in the middle of that, and I think most of us will soon be in the middle of that. Thank you. Thank you for the opportunity.
Thank you, Virat. As usual, your questions are perceptive and to the point. Look, first on import substitution, and by I have been by any definition, and including in the report, a quote unquote a free trader, not a believer in import substitution, not a believer in protection, I would say. The world, because of globalization and what countries have done, and in particular what China did to show the path to the world, that there was rapid progress to be had, and is a model for a lot of the countries. Remember, they did it through import substitution. Now, Paul Krugman has come out, and one of the original free traders, a Nobel Prize winner, stating that, because of globalization, what one thinks about import substitution is somewhat different than before. Nevertheless, so what we have to do, so I'm not so much against import substitution and self-sufficiency. As long as the incentives are there. There are 7.6 billion people in the world, and red blood goes through all of them. And we have to recognize that the red blood means individuals, countries react to incentives. So there can be a package of policy, but which has self-sufficiency in it, but also provides incentives for competitiveness. I don't think, it used to be thought that the two are contradictory, and that is why I invoked some recent thinking on the subject. So, but there's also the political economy. This is the question that was brought up by Nisha just a few minutes ago. Look, the political economy is the big elephant in the room, which is there, which will always be there. And there are interest groups, and the governments of the day have to balance various interest groups, various industrial groups, various, stakeholders. And sometimes, and oftentimes, you fall in the cracks. And my entire belief is that recognize that the cracks are there and minimize them. And I think that is why I'm so bullish on India. We have the target of doubling exports, etc. And very well, we talked in detail as to how that could happen. The other thing that we need to recognize is that trade growth. One of the things actually between which a lot of the Indians are really fond of making this point, that look at Indian exports between 2010 and 2018. The Indian export level in 2018 in dollar terms was exactly the same as 2011. And how can that happen? Well, I've got news. The world exports in 2018 were 1 or 2 percentage points less than in 2011. You know, so basically, the world, I keep coming back to, the world has changed. It is no longer possible to, quote unquote, exploit the world and grow faster. What you have to do is to provide incentives for manufacturers, for people. We just had a question on agriculture. You want to provide incentives to farmers to produce. You want incentives for industrialists to produce. You want incentives for exporters to do so. So it's complex, but we didn't do the reforms earlier. We did some, absolutely. That's why bracketed, we moved closer to Earth between 1990 and 2014, and we're moving closer now. We're not there. So that's all. But I think we shouldn't be caught up with the, self-sufficiency, this, that, import substitution is bad. No, we should say this is where we need to be. We are not competitive, and we need to be competitive, whether it is in interest rates, whether it is being in farmers, wherever. That's what the focus should be. And let's not get distracted by, things like import substitution, export promotion. That world has changed. It's gone. It's gone. Those debates are over. Brand new world. Welcome.
Excellent thoughts. Thank you.
Thank you, Virat, and thank you, Dr. Bhalla. I know that we're over time. You have, I think, opened up an entire new box for discussion, which is the notion of competitiveness and the various sectors in which the folks around this table look for competitiveness and exactly what you spoke of, incentives that propel the market forward. So certainly we'd like to ask you back in the future when you have some time to continue this discussion and give us a nuanced and unique perspective on the Indian investment climate. But I'd like to not keep people too long. I'd like to thank Mahindra and Ritika for being an important partner in this endeavor with US IBC overall, but even in this discussion to help us understand what's happening in India. So thank you, Ritika, for joining us. I did want to share that what you've done is you've opened up this discussion of FDI and where there is an appetite. To that end, US IBC submits an annual budget submission where we do really address issues of competitiveness, address issues of investor protections, market regimes. In fact, we didn't get to this question. We've got two questions that I will pass on to you afterwards and connect you with the individuals. But it's a really important exercise that US IBC does on behalf of its members to identify not just areas of potential investment, but the nuts and bolts of what needs to happen in order to bring that investment in. So for all of the folks on the phone, you should have something from your policy directors at US IBC to talk about providing us with this input in terms of the key priorities that you have where you see change can enhance operations, growth, expansion, whether it be larger at the level of the ease of business or whether it be granular and specific in your particular sectors, such as manufacturing. But we invite your comments both at a tax and a policy level. And you can certainly always reach out to myself or Surjit Singh, who's also on this call, to connect with us on how you'd like to provide your input. Dr. Bhalla, we're happy to share this document with you when it's developed so that you get a sense of what's important to our companies as they look to make true the promise of your bullish sentiment on India. Finally, I've received requests for the report that you've authored that Mr. Virat Bhatia has mentioned. I hope that you're open to sharing it. If so, we'll share it with the participants.
Yeah.
So with that, I'd like to thank you all and turn to Nisha to close us out.
Oh, I think you closed us nicely, and I just want to say thank you. I think that the U.S. India corridor is an incredibly important one, and one of great opportunity and potential, but it really does take the efforts of all of us working with our partners in government on both sides to really make that that potential a reality. So I want to thank Dr. Bhalla for his time with us today, but also for the insights and analysis that he shares not only with us, but the guidance that he provides into the government on some of these key issues. So thank you all, and we will continue to bring to you these thought-provoking conversations. And thank you again, Mahindra, as well. Be well, everybody. Be safe.
Yeah. Thank you.
Bye-bye. Thank you.
Thank you, Surjit.